Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Angela Nardozi, and welcome to our webinar teaching about pre-confederation treaties. I'm super excited to go. This evening, we have a wonderful guest who I've had the pleasure of hearing speak before. His name is Ojiig Corbiere, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. But there's a few things that I want to speak to you about first. First of all, I'll introduce myself. As I said, my name is Angela, and I am a settler and a guest on Turtle Island. My family came to this land from Italy, and I grew up in Markham, Ontario. And I'm currently working partially at the University of Toronto at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, teaching in the Masters of Teaching program. And I also work on my own in terms of my consulting and coaching at Listen and Learn. Today, unfortunately, we are not going to be joined by my partner in this amazing work, but a huge hello to Dr. John Paul Restoule, who is currently the Professor and Chair of Indigenous Education at the University of Victoria. We're also being supported this evening by Erica Finestone from the University of Victoria, who's going to be on the chat, ensuring your questions get answered, and also by our technical guru of the series, my husband, Danny. So if you have any issues, I know that you received his email as well, and you please feel free to email him if you're having any technical behind-the-scenes issues. Wonderful. So before we begin as well, I wanted to acknowledge I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Mississauga peoples, the Seneca, the Petun, and the Wendat peoples. And it's important that we begin in this way. And Alan might want to also offer an acknowledgement as we get going. And I'll bring him on, as I said, shortly. And as you may know, this may be your first time attending, but this is the Kiki New Amajawin webinar series, which John Paul last time translated for us means the land points the way, and that's how he interpreted that in the Anishnaabe Moen. And so loosely thinking around place-based learning and loosely thinking about the direction forward of Indigenous education. And so we're coming together with this series of webinars. If you haven't seen the other ones and you're interested, you can find them at my website, angelanardozi.com/webinars, which we'll post that link later as well. But I'm really excited, like I said, to get started today. So, and of course, a huge thank you to our sponsors, yay sponsors. The funding for this evening is coming to us from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Restoule is doing some research funded by them. And as you exit this webinar tonight, if you're an educator, if you're a teacher, you'll see you're going to go right directly to a short anonymous survey. And we welcome you, if you're interested and you haven't before, to participate in that. It's around supporting how the research around how we can better support teachers who are teaching Indigenous education and Indigenous content in general. Okay, so what are we doing today? As soon as I introduce Alan, he's going to jump right into his presentation. We've got some resources that we've put together for you, just a short list of some really great things out there to bring to all different levels about treaties. And then, of course, if you have any questions at any time, Erica is going to be putting them in, sort of collecting them, putting them in the chat for me to see on the admin side, and we're going to be looking through them. So hopefully we'll get your questions answered by Alan as we go. Okay, so Alan, I'm going to bring Alan's camera up and then turn on his mic. So bear with us as we just get everything going. And as he gets all sorted, I will introduce him as Alan Ojiig Corbiere from the Bene Dodem. That is the Rough Grouse clan. And Alan is Anishnaabe from from Manitoulin Island. Alan was educated on the reserve, and then attended the University of Toronto for a Bachelor of Science. And then afterwards entered York University and earned his Master's in Environmental Studies. He spent a lot of time serving his community and learning the Anishnaabe language. And he's an amazing speaker. I know he does talks in many different forums across the province. And currently he's entering his second year in the PhD history program at York University. And so just to get us started off in a good way, here we go, Ruffed Grouse Clan. There you go, Alan, that one's for you. There's the Ruffed Grouse.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, there he is, yeah. Okay, Nana Bojo, Ninso Jik Benendo dem, Wedem Chiging Don Jaba, Chinandam Dasha, we Kijiu na Goya, we the Batama, Gajwe Bak Mampi, Chikeminissing. So my Anishinaabe name is Ojiig, and that means the fisher. And I'm from Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island, that used to be called West Bay. And then the older name before that was Machugwadnong, the bluff in the shape of a spearhead. And we have a story there where Nanabush ran through our island there, and he dropped his spear over there. So I grew up, I didn't know Anishinaabe, and I didn't know anything about treaties either when I went to school at Lakeview Public School in Chiging. And then I didn't learn much more either at Manitoulin Secondary School as well. And it was only when I came down to the University of Toronto that I started to learn a bit more about treaties and about Native studies. And some of the people that I had the privilege of listening to while I was at the University of Toronto in my undergrad were the late Jake Thomas, the late Ernie Benedict, and I got to listen to John Mohawk and Joe Couture, as well as a host of others. But the majority of them actually were Haudenosaunee people that I got to listen to at that time. And so, like I was saying, I didn't really know much about my own history then. And so I heard Jake Thomas talk about the dish with one spoon, and I heard Ernie talk about Mohawk worldview as well. And then, of course, Bruce Elijah talked about the Oneida. So it was a real very Haudenosaunee-centric introduction to treaties that I actually got introduced to. And it was wampum belts that they talked about as well, and their great law. And it was set me off on wondering, well, what's ours? What is Anishinaabe treaties like? So after a while, that's what I ended up finding out, that we did use wampum belts as well and wampum strings. And of course, I did know we used pipes. So this first slide that's on your screen is actually I think it's on your left. On my left is a whelk shell. And that inside that whelk shell is a column right down the middle of that. And that's where you get the white wampum. So you see that white wampum in the middle of that belt. That's what that is, whelk shell. And then on the right hand, top right hand, is a quahog shell. And that's where they would get the purple wampum. This was more valuable because it was more rare, and it actually took a lot longer to actually grow as well. So the one thing that I wanted to mention is you'll hear a lot of people talk about this binary, and that's what the wampum belts actually are, of course, as a binary, white and purple. But if you ever get a chance to actually look at some of the old council proceedings as well as council minutes, the secretaries will have written about these. They'll call them that they gave a belt, and they'll say gave a belt black, and that you see on that wampum belt there how dark some of that purple is, that it does look black. So there isn't an actual black belt per se, like not like karate or anything, but it's just that the purple was so deep that it looked like a black belt. The other thing to mention, just on a bit of a tangent, is that I was talking to a fellow who actually still harvests this quahog and tries to make the real wampum from the shells. Is that he said when he was a kid, the quahog shell used to grow bigger than they do now, and for whatever reason, they actually aren't growing as big as they used to. So it's harder now even to get a really good mature quahog shell to make the purple wampum. The other thing that's on the screen there is called a calumet pipe. And many people, of course, have seen a pipe. And usually you will see that the size of a pipe stem now is from the tip of your finger to your elbow. But these calumet stems are actually from the tip of your finger, all the length of your arm to your heart. So those are very large uh, pipe stems, and they were decorated, as you see, with eagle feathers on there. You'll see later that there's one. Sometimes they're painted red with dyed with red ochre or vermilion, and then that would have been a war pipe, and then a peace pipe would have been one that wasn't painted. So these were often decorated. You see the feathers on there of the eagle, but there's also feathers of the top parts of woodpecker heads on there, and then there are also porcupine quill wrapped around there as well. So there's a lot of different symbolism in there. The point that I really wanted to emphasize here is that with these pre-confederation treaties, there are more to it than the written word. That when we look at these pre-confederation treaties, we have to look at wampum, pipes, and metals, and each of these have the different meaning that go along with the treaty and enhance the treaty's meaning, and they're actually used as mnemonic devices for Anishnaabe people and Haudenosaunee people in recalling the terms of the treaty that they entered into. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that for these pre-confederation treaties, what we really have to wrap our head around is that it's more than English. So it sounds obvious that it's just written in English, but all the people at that time just spoke their own indigenous language. So at the actual custom was that if you went to Europe at that time, they actually made 3 copies of a treaty. So let's say it was Spain and Germany that were entering into a treaty in Europe. So there would be a copy written in Spanish and another written in German, and then the third would be written in French. And they said if there were any disputes in the Spanish and German version, then they would consult the French version. So for Anishnaabe people and Haudenosaunee people, by the time these pre-confederation treaties are being written up, they actually had translated the Bible and other hymns and sermons and stuff. So they actually had the capacity to translate these treaties into our languages. And there were already orthographies at that time as well. So we got to recognize that it was actually more or less a deliberate purpose that they didn't write our version in our languages for us, even though they had priests and translators who could actually do that at that time. So the other thing is that when we look at how the treaties were entered into, it was actually diplomatic discourse that they used. They used a very metaphoric language, and I'll expand upon this later. But you have to contrast that basically with the English document that actually is legalese. So when you look at the legalese of the written document, then you look at the written speeches that council proceedings, you see how the native people, the indigenous people talk about it in a metaphoric language. And our challenge now is to actually understand what those metaphors mean, and that's what more research is required on. So the last point, and again, this seems obvious, but the thing is sometimes that people don't really seem to recognize this, is that there are 2 sides to the story. So some of the treaties I'm going to talk about are between the Anishnaabe and the Haudenosaunee. So there's actually 2 sides to that story, to that treaty. And then, or there's Anishnaabe and British. So there will also be 2 sides to that as well. So when you're teaching, like I see on the side of this this panel here, that there are primary, junior, intermediate, senior, and post-secondary teachers listening to this, that actually there's different ways you would try to engage students into teaching this. Of course, you can get more complex and as well, but the way is to actually just introduce it. And what my intent today is to actually just try and emphasize real, very back to basics, basically, that to enter into a treaty is for Anishnaabe people, how that was actually done, rather than getting into the actual deeds and conveyances and the legalese about it. I actually want to talk more, emphasize more about the Anishinaabe way of remembering, recording, and then decoding, and then also reciting. So the one here that this is a picture of a fellow named Peter Jones, and he was a Methodist missionary, but his father was Augustus Jones, who was a Welsh-born uh, uh, Englishman, and he ended up moving to Upper Canada and was the surveyor. So he actually surveyed much of southern Ontario. And then he married a woman, Mississauga woman, and he had two children with her, and he had another wife and a Mohawk wife, apparently. Anyway, Peter Jones, later as he grew up, he ended up converting to Methodism and became a Methodist missionary. But he was, of course, literate in English, and he was also fluent in Anishinaabe. But he wrote down these different treaties between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, to which we maybe, I guess I should say that the Haudenosaunee are currently called the Six Nations. And then I'm assuming you all know that, but then also they're also referred to as the Iroquois. But and Anishinaabe people include Mississauga, the Nipissing, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, Algonquin, and the Saulteaux out west. So these are different names that we're calling we're using our own names for ourselves now, and this is starting to gain more strength. Anyway, here one of the treaties. This is what he wrote down, and this is the Anishinaabe version, and the Haudenosaunee have a different version of this as well, but they call it the dish with one spoon. And in we got a document written in 1845 by the chiefs of Manitoulin, and they wrote to the Haudenosaunee chiefs at Kanesatake because they had heard that the Kanesatake chiefs were going to come to Manitoulin, and they actually were going to move there due to pressures uh, to actually move Protestant pressures to remove Catholic people from that area. So anyway, they came up. They came up to Manitoulin eventually, but the before they did, the Manitoulin chiefs wrote in Ojibwe and they said if you come here, they said be don gado naganana, and in our language that means bring our dish, getchepi tendalgok we, that one that is highly valued. That's what they had written in that petition. Bring our dish that we all highly value. So actually, the linguist who had written that, thought it was about a piece of uh, mass, a dish that was used in celebrating mass, like maybe where the host was put or anything like that, because he just didn't know what the Godot Naganana would mean, our dish. So subsequent research was done, and a fellow named Victor Litwin, if any of you want to research this more, this is a fellow named Lytwyn, and he had written an article on the dish with one spoon and went through the archives to find out how many different people or how many times it was recorded in the archival record, and that's in the Algonquian proceedings. Anyway, Peter Jones also writes about this. In our language, why I put a G\N there is we have a concept. When we say we in English, you don't know if I'm saying we including you or we excluding you. So, like if I'm saying to Angela, I'll say, "Yeah, we went to a restaurant last night." I'm not including her. She knows she would know by the context that I'm talking about myself and whoever I was with last night. But now I could say to Angela, we are on a Demio platform, and so she's included. So how we do this in Ojibwe is we say Godot Naganana, and that means Angela is included. But if I say Ndo Naganana, Angela isn't included, but I'm saying we. So that's we inclusive or we exclusive. So what I'm seeing now a lot, Native people, Anishnaabe people are using this word to refer to that dish with one spoon. And that dish actually, the dish is just noggin. That's all a dish means in Ojibwe is noggin. But when you put a prefix and you put the suffix on there, then that's when you indicate if it's ours or yours or mine. Anyway, people are using Godot, Noggin, and Na all over the place. But to me, it actually doesn't always represent everybody. So I just think that we still have to do further research on how we use our words, our Anishinaabe words as well. And I find that we're just people don't understand enough of our language that they end up just adopting it and using it, which is good. It's a positive step, of course, but it's a process to keep it going.
Alan, thank you. I'm sure the only one person here raising my hand up.
Yeah.
We have a question.
Okay.
The person would like to know the dish, the geographical region of the dish. Do you know, does that include what we now call Kingston?
Yeah, that's what the first record. I shouldn't say the first, but to me, from what I understand, the dish actually was first introduced by the Haudenosaunee amongst themselves when they formed their league of 5 nations. And then afterward, one of the first instances that it's recorded in a treaty is actually the 1701 Great Peace of Montreal. So, in essence, you can actually say that the dish actually includes all of the Great Lakes. Because when in 1701 they had I forget the exact number of delegates from nations all over the Great Lakes that went to Montreal to partake in this great treaty. And it's at that point that Governor Callier actually used the metaphor of the dish, meaning the land, that would actually go all the way out to the Mississippi. So when I mentioned Victor Litwin's work, he actually found out the Sauk and Fox people on the western shore of Lake Michigan also used that phrase, the dish, to refer to the actual treaty and referring to the land as well. So it sounds like when you read that Great Peace of 1701, it sounds like Callier actually gave either strings of wampum or belts to each nation that were present, because he said, "I give you these to tell your old people what had happened here, what has transpired, and your young people." So it looks like they could have actually gave dish belts to a number of different nations. And so even the Sioux at that time were living a bit east of the Mississippi, so they also referred to the dish, they referred to the land as the dish as well. So this is 1701. This is how old this particular treaty is. So, and as you see on this slide, that it says it was held at the east end of Lake Ontario, but they don't actually say Cataraqui or Kingston or Fort Frontenac. They just say at the east end of Lake Ontario. So the other part of this, usually I talk a bit more about the war between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe before setting this up. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times the reason for having a treaty is there's a dispute, usually. And so it's a dispute resolution with these belts, these wampum belts, in order to establish peace and as well as to establish either sharing of resources or safety of each other. So this first treaty is called the dish with one spoon, but it was given according to Peter Jones, at the east end of Lake Ontario. And the belt was in the form of a dish or bowl in the center, which the chief said represented that the Ojibways and Six Nations were all to eat out of the same dish, that is, to have all their game in common. In the center of the bowl were a few white wampums, which represented a beaver's tail, the favorite dish of the Ojibways. So to me, this is the interesting part, is that the dish actually isn't empty, that there's actually something in there, and that the Haudenosaunee put in the tail in that dish and then gave that dish to the Anishnaabe. So one of the exercises you can actually think of is, of course, they call this time the Beaver Wars as well. So if you look at the transcript here, the Haudenosaunee are giving a belt, and they are figuratively or metaphorically, if you want to say, giving the best part, because the Anishinaabe and others looked at the beaver tail as a delicacy. They're giving the best part to the Anishinaabe at that time as well. So there's more to this that we have to try and understand, that I personally don't fully understand yet, and I'm thinking more about it, and I've got to ask some of our elders and knowledge keepers a bit more of what does it mean to actually give somebody the best part of the animal, and so, and then also about the tail. Okay, Angela.
Sorry, Alan. I just wanted to ask, I've heard of it referred to as the one dish, one spoon. And I've heard of it referred to in the past as like the spoon being in the middle. Tell me more. Is that like a new thing? What's that about? Do you know?
I've never heard of the spoon being in the middle. I've just heard the dish with
I think
one
I'm making it
spoon.
up. I think it's
And then I heard Jake Thomas say this, that what their tradition was is that they were not to actually, they were told that they were not to bring any sharp objects around the dish, and that the dish itself, because for fear of bloodshed, if a knife were brought around the dish and somebody were accidentally cut and blood shed, then there would be consequences. So that's why they said nobody was allowed to bring a knife or a sharp object around the dish. Secondly, if you actually read that great piece of Montreal in 1701, you'll see that Governor Callier actually, when he sends everyone out, he actually sends them with the dish, he says, and a spoon and a knife. So what I find interesting in that particular case is the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe make sure that there is no knife around their dish, because it's a peace treaty between the two of them. But the French outfit everybody with a knife, it sounds like, well, figuratively. And the reason I think it is, I might be wrong on this is a bit of a speculation, is that of course, they want the fur trade to continue. So they're outfitting the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee with the utensils in order to procure hides. So that's what I think of that. But some people, when I bring that up, they don't kind of like that. They don't look at it as that's actually part of the historical record, that they were supposedly given knives at 1701. But the Haudenosaunee, they say that there was to be no knives around the dish.
okay. And sorry, go ahead.
No,
just
go
one
ahead.
more question.
Ask.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience with me. Just one more question from the audience. Is there a particular or approximate date? I mean, you've mentioned a few dates, but like just so that we're really clear, where we first hear about this particular belt, and is it still active today? What is your take?
The first concrete mention is 1701, but it exists. Like I said, it existed, as far as I know and understand. It existed amongst the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations, before they became the 6 nations, and there's likely no solid date on that. It's just that when maybe they would couch it in it, saying that when the Confederacy was formed. So that's that. The thing with oral tradition is that we don't really have the chronological dates, or the Julian calendar as well. So, and they'll talk about it as generations, or the time of when we were at war with each other.
Thank you.
So the other belt that was renewed that Peter Jones recorded, people call this the Yellowhead belt. I don't like to call it that, because the chief was named Yellowhead, and he was from what was now the reserve is now called Rama, but it was in the historical record it's referred to the Narrows, but in Ojibwe it's called Menjikaning, and that means the place of the fish weir, or the place of the fence. So that's where Lake Simcoe meets Lake Cochiching up by Atherley Narrows in Ontario, which is they have this old fish weir, and they dated that weir prior to contact. So archaeologists have a different way of dating that. So this particular belt, again, like I said, mentioned, this is the Anishnaabe version because I'm using the record that Peter Jones had written down. And Peter Jones had said that the Six Nations had come to renew these belts with the Anishnaabe. And this is in Peter Jones's book, A History of the Ojibwe People, with a special reference to their conversion to Christianity. So you can find that book actually if you go to the internetarchive.org. And so that book is free online if you want to, if you're interested and you have the time to go through that. But you'll be able to read that. So we reconstructed this belt, myself and a friend of mine named Brian Charles. We were looking at how would we make this belt, and this was one version. We actually made another version as well. Anyway, it gets, I guess it gets a bit beyond the scope of this particular session to get into that. But here, this belt was given by the Haudenosaunee to the Anishinaabe, and we date this one. I'm basing this date actually on Jim Morrison, who is a historian and knows a lot about the Anishinaabe record in the Lake Huron, Lake Superior area. And he told me that he believes, and I can concur, that this belt actually would have dated between 1695 and 1701, that it was before the Great Peace of Montreal. But why I guess I'm saying here is this is the Anishinaabe version, but the Haudenosaunee say when Peter Jones wrote this down, it was in the care of Chief William Yellowhead of the Narrows. So what I didn't finish my thought was at that time was when I said I don't like it being called Yellowhead's belt, because this is actually belongs to the people, the Anishinaabe people. It doesn't belong to one person. And when we start naming it after one person, then that family or the descendants think it's theirs. And you see this with medals and other patrimonial items that got alienated from the communities and are in museums now. So that's why I find it problematic to actually call this as Yellowhead's belt, but that's actually what people have started to call it. So I learned this from Professor Darlene Johnson, who's from Cape Croker. And if you want to read more about her work, you can Google the Ipperwash Inquiry, and she talks about this a bit more. Anyway, she showed me this and she taught me about this. So we ended up, Brian Charles and I, and Ken Miracle. I also had Ken Miracle, who was a Mohawk from Six Nations, wampum belt maker, make a version of this belt as well. So the actual transcript is that Yellowhead had a belt, and it was John Smoke Johnson who read the belt to him because they were the ones who had given it. So he said that, and Peter Jones described it. We don't know the actual original belt. We don't know where it is. If it was destroyed or if it's in a museum still, we don't know of its whereabouts. So this is a total reconstruction based on what we know now. And maybe we're wrong, but it's a teaching tool. So what Peter Jones had written was that there were 5 marks on there and a white line through the middle, meaning the road of peace. So for our treaties, when we have a straight line in the middle of a wampum belt, that means a road of peace. And that means, of course, now we would say stuff like the straight and narrow, taking the straight and narrow. And then he had said the first marking on there represents that that our ancestors, meaning the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, met at council in Sault Ste. Marie. Then they said the second emblem on the wampum belt represents that our ancestors, meaning the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, ignited a council fire, an eternal council fire, at Manitoulin Island. and our ancestors placed there a white fish, and that white fish represented pure heartedness, as well that that white fish was to watch over that council fire for eternity. And they said the third emblem on the belt represented that a council fire was ignited on an island in Penetanguishene Bay, and that a beaver was placed there, and that that beaver represented wisdom, that all the actions of our ancestors were done in wisdom. And then they said the fourth emblem on that belt said represented that our ancestors, the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, ignited a council fire at the Narrows. And he said, at the Narrows, our ancestors placed a white reindeer, and they ignited this council fire, and the white reindeer was the one who was entrusted to keep this belt or this talk. And that's the word that they used. They kept this talk. So the reindeer were the ones to keep this talk. And they said, and our ancestors placed a dish at the Narrows, meaning the dish with one spoon as well. So they said the fifth emblem on the belt is that our ancestors, the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, ignited a council fire at the mouth of the River Credit. And they said that at the mouth of the River Credit stands a tall pine tree, and that at the top of this tall pine tree, our ancestors placed a bald-headed eagle. And this bald-headed eagle represented swiftness as well as farsightedness, and that if he saw or detected any danger, he was then to fly to tell that caribou reindeer at the Narrows, and then also fly and tell that beaver at that island in Penetanguishene Bay, and tell that fish at Manitoulin, and then go tell the people at Sault Ste. Marie. So that's what this treaty is. It was a treaty that stopped what's commonly called the Beaver Wars, or some call it the Iroquois Wars or the Mohawk Wars. But this is the belt that they gave to the Anishinaabe. And so how these treaties were kept, they actually recited them back to each other when they would renew them, so that they both understood that they were on the same page. So what I now want to try and propose that this belt be called is the Eternal Council Fire Belt instead of a Yellowhead's belt. So I hope that catches on, but I don't know if it is. I'm trying to get it away from being called Yellowhead's belt. The reason they call it Yellowhead's belt is because he was the chief of the Narrows, and he was the one at that particular time who was the keeper of the belt. So what we don't know is when he died, who then became the keeper of that belt. And what we don't know positively, but we can surmise, is that his father was the keeper of that belt before him, and perhaps his grandfather, but it may not necessarily have been his grandfather. It could have been a granduncle. So, but it was the chief of the Narrows of the Caribou clan who was entrusted to keep that wampum belt, and that the dish was placed at the Narrows, and also a dish was placed at the mouth of the River Credit. But as you see here in this quote that Peter Jones had written, he says, a dish was also placed at the Credit, that the right of hunting on the north side of the lake, meaning Ontario, was secured to the Ojibways, and the Six Nations were not to hunt here, only when they come to smoke the pipe of peace with their Ojibwe brethren. So again, this is the Anishinaabe version, the Ojibwe version, the Mississauga version of this treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. Right now, the way Haudenosaunee people talk about it, they really wouldn't say that it doesn't sound like they talk about having to smoke the pipe of peace together before coming to hunt. Anyway, that's what this version of this belt is, this wampum belt, and it's a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. Are there any other questions before I go to the next?
None are coming up right at this moment.
Okay.
So yeah, let's keep moving and see if more come up as we go.
So basically, the dish with one spoon was a treaty on its own, and then it became a treaty within a treaty here. And this is the thing, is that these all accumulate. That's the other thing that I want to say. Tell people is that the belts actually accumulate, and people are entrusted to keep that talk, and they were the ones to memorize it. The other thing that's significant here is that the Haudenosaunee had their version and they had to read it and they had to remember that they gave this and they had to come and renew it. And the Anishnaabe knew where this belt came from, and they had people who kept it and kept the talk on it as well and maintained that. So people were trained to do this, and that was their duty as wampum keepers to be knowledgeable about that, as well as being chiefs. They had to know this as well. So it wasn't just one chief usually that knew this. A lot of the chiefs knew it, but there was one who was one wampum belt keeper. This is a fella named Charles Cobbalgum, and he was from Marquette, Michigan, and it was Sault Ste. Marie area. Anyway, the thing that I wanted to show here is that he talks about that there was a treaty between the Ojibwe, the Odawa, Potawatomi, and the Menominee. And the Menominee are a nation that live around Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is on the left side of uh, well, it depends where you're facing, but Lake Michigan, that arm there. So he said that I believe this meeting was held at Sault Ste. Marie in the time of my father's grandfather. The pipe and belt of wampum used in that council are still at the Sioux in the keeping of my brother Wabamimi. Wabamimi means white pigeon, chief by the English treaty. So this Wabamimi did sign treaties in the historic era as well. The belt is decorated with a stripe of white beads which runs all around the middle and is called the Road of Peace. The edges outside the white stripe are colored. The meaning of the pipe and also of the belt of wampum was that these were a pledge of everlasting peace and bound brothers to help anyone of them that might be in trouble. For by this treaty the four tribes made an eternal brotherhood. So I put a belt there that I couldn't find a belt that just had the road there. It was quite common though, is that a purple belt would have one white stripe going through it, and that meant the road of peace. But usually when you see a diamond on a belt, it refers to a nation. So this particular belt has three diamonds on it, and it's actually a belt that was in the possession of the Huron-Wendat. And then a fella had bought it and purchased it, and then it's now resides. This is the actual picture of the actual one, and this wampum belt actually resides at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, England. And the retelling of it is that there was three tribes that had allied themselves, and that they had free passage through each of their country. So why I wanted to show this one is that what Cobbalgum is talking about here is the belt that he's referring to could actually just have a white stripe through, or it could actually have a white stripe and four diamonds, but he doesn't say the four diamonds. But I know that there is actually another belt from that area as well that included those same four, but it also included the Ho-Chunk, which are more commonly known as the Winnebago tribe or nation, and then also the Sauk and Fox. So that there were actually seven diamond. There's a belt referred to, and it has a road of peace through it, and it has seven diamonds on it, representing those seven nations. So this is another way that Anishinaabe people encoded treaties of alliance. So the important thing there with Cobbalgum, what he mentioned, is that the wampum belt and the pipe of peace. So these actually were integral parts of the treaty. This fella here, his father's name was Makadebenese, and he was an Odawa chief that fought during the War of 1812. This particular fella's name is actually Andrew J. Blackbird, and he wrote a book called The History of the Odawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan. Also, if you want to read that book, it's on in that internetarchive.org as well. Anyway, he had written his understanding of his people's history as the way he heard it from his father and his uncles and his old people. So one of the things that he writes about is that every tribe of Indians far and near, even as far as the Manitoba country out north, deposited their pipe of peace with the head chief of the Odawa nation as a pledge of continual peace and friendship. So if you can imagine actually that the thing that I don't really get to talk about here yet, just because of time, is the importance of the council fire. And not only the council fire, but at a council fire, there would be a host nation or a host chief that actually kept wampum belts and pipes of peace there. So later on, uh, uh, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there was a place called Brownstown, which was south of Detroit, and this was called the Confederacy, the Council Fire of the Western Confederacy. And the Western Confederacy included at that time the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, but the Huron Wendat, it was their town. That Brownstown was their town, and they were the uncles of the Confederacy. So I don't want to get too much into that, but the way the Confederacy would be talked about are in kinship terms. So they were the uncles, and that meant that they had knowledge. And then the Delaware and the Munsees were the grandfathers. The Anishnaabe called them grandfathers because they recognized them as being an older stock of people, they say. And then the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, the story is that these were three brothers at one time. And the Odawa and Ojibwe kind of argue about who is actually the eldest brother, but all of them agree that the Potawatomi are the youngest brother of those. So for us now, of course, in this day and age, we don't, uh, people are getting Botox, they're getting facelifts, they dye their hair, you know, whereas back then, people asked for a long life, to be blessed with to see many winters and to see many grandchildren and great grandchildren, and that was a thing that they sought. They sought long life. So that was the difference between now and then. Okay,
We've
Angela.
got two questions which have come up, Alan. The first is who, it's a little bit of a fast forward, who would be in charge of renewing these, I guess, treaty relationships today? Some nations don't seem to have traditional leadership models, only colonial implemented elected councils. So who's in charge these days? What's going on?
That's a good question. So for the Haudenosaunee, they do have an elected council, but they have maintained their longhouse people, their traditional people. And for Anishinaabe people, we have the majority are actually band elected through the Department of Indian Affairs, and the same with in the states. They have their BIA elected chiefs, tribal chairs. But there is a society called the Medewin. Whether or not they would be the ones to renew it with the Haudenosaunee is a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that because I actually posed that question. I went and talked to what we call a PTO, Provincial Territorial Organization, called the Union of Ontario Indians, that's based in Nipissing, Ontario, and 41 First Nations belong to it. Anyway, I posed to them. I says, "Well, what if we wanted to renew this belt with the Haudenosaunee? Who do we send? Who would we send?" And some would say, "Well, it's our Grand Chief that is elected by the chiefs from the 41 First Nations." But then others would say, "Well, it's the Grand Chief of the Ontario." But then others would say, "Well, actually, if we're doing this as a Ojibwe Anishinaabe or Odawa Anishinaabe, we have to include those in the states as well." And so, abiding by Ontario boundaries doesn't make any sense
Mm.
either. So at this point, we haven't really made a transnational or border uh, entity that would say, okay, these people are the ones who would be the ones to renew these belts or be the ones to renew that treaty.
Mm.
So the simple answer, though, that I think is that uh, in the actual treaty talk that Jones records, is that it would be uh, a chief of the Narrows who carries or who is of the Adikado Dem, who is of the Caribou clan. So if they found that particular band, if they found a suitable person and they all decided as a community, they said this person is of the Caribou clan, he's living an upright life and he's a smart fella and he believes in Anishinaabe Bamadzuin, we entrust him to be the one that would keep this belt. That's how I think it would go. And then he's the one that was entrusted with it, and it's based on the tradition of that belt and how it was given back in the 1690s, and that it was entrusted to a person of the Caribou clan who lived at the Narrows. And that's who I think would be, for this particular belt, who would be the keeper
Okay.
of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then we have another question.
Okay.
That last one was from Joe. Thank you, Joe. This one's from Harriet. Harriet wants to know, the Maasai in Africa are trying to get artifacts back from the Pitt River Museum. Are Canadian Indigenous folks, or just, I guess, Indigenous people on Turtle Island and in this area, are they trying to get the belt you just mentioned back, or any of these belts back?
That belt that I showed with the three, actually, the provenance is that it belonged to the Huron. So it would have to, as far as I know, I don't know of any of the Huron that are actually trying to repatriate that. The interesting thing, I read an article either in the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star this weekend, and it wasn't the Pitt Rivers, but it was actually France. The French president actually said and pledged that they would be giving back items that they took from Africa, and they're reversing the burden of proof from the communities of Africa to prove their provenance, that it's actually the museum that has to prove the provenance, that they actually procured that legitimately. So if there's no proof of legitimately purchasing that in a good way, then they're going to send that back. But of course, it isn't as simple as that, and there's all these uh, legal issues because it's patrimony there. So, but the president is the one who pledged that, and the previous one apparently pledged that as well. But they actually have to work around their own laws to make that happen. So whether or not that actually happens in France for indigenous people here, that would be another avenue of how some of this stuff would be repatriated. So but that isn't for the Pitt Rivers Museum at this point.
Thank you. Alan, I'm just noting we're probably going to go a little bit over time. Is that okay with you? Do you want me to cut you off at a certain point? I mean, we can keep taping, and people who can stay. It's really up to you, Alan.
I'll get as far as I
Okay.
can. Then, and whoever stays, then and whoever goes, it's. So here, this is another Calumet pipe, and you see it's got the red pipestone, and you see it's got the tail feathers of a golden eagle, and it also has the woodpecker heads. Again, there's more to the idea is to actually look at the medium as well. But here, this is in 1760. Of course, this is the time when the French and the British are fighting for the colonial supremacy in North America, and the Anishnaabe, basically, with some exceptions, the Anishnaabe sided with the French. Here, the Odawa speaker, it says here, the Odawa speaker then took up the pipe of peace belonging to the nation and said, "Brother, to confirm what we have said to you, I give you this peace pipe, which is known to all the nations living in this country, and when they see it, they will know it to be the pipe of peace belonging to our nation." Then he delivered the pipe. So 4 years later, after Pontiac's war, Pontiac went to war against the British as well as the Seneca chief named Gayasota. They Pontiac gets all the accolades, but Gayasota actually played a critical role as well, the Seneca chief. Anyway, it says here 27th July 1764, Tecumseh, and that's actually Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods area in Ontario. And Shage in Ojibwe, Shage means a heron, not a crane. But anyway, he says, "Brother, this pipe is sent by all our chiefs. We were obliged several times along the road to hoist up this pipe in our canoe to prevent our being scratched on our way. We now leave it here with you, that it may be used whenever any of our people come here, and then think of the friendship subsisting between them and the English. Then lay down the pipe." So just like in this previous slide, where the Odawa Council Fire had all of these pipes of peace from different nations, and it was kept by the Odawa head chief of the Odawa, as well as his Mijinoe, his helper, that they were then to keep those pipes, and whenever they came to that nation came to the council fire, they bring that pipe out and smoke it. The same thing occurred with the British. Wherever they had a council fire, there were many pipes deposited, and this was with Sir William Johnson, who we could now refer to as, in a sense, the first Minister of Indian Affairs for British North America. But of course, his title was Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for the Northern Superintendency of British North America. And that's a painting of him there. So in 1763, the Pontiac and others went to war against the British, and they were never able to successfully take Fort Detroit, but they did take Fort Michilimackinac and other ones, and they weren't able to take Fort Pitt either. But the point was made that they actually said that they were the masters of this land, and that they were the ones who had to be entered into treaty with. So here, what Sir William Johnson said, this is in July of 1764 at Niagara. He invited all the nations that he could to come down to enter into a general peace with everyone. So he says, "Brother, you have now been here for several days, during which time we have frequently met to renew and strengthen our engagements, and you have made so many promises of your friendship and attachment to the English that there now only remains for us to exchange the great belt of the covenant chain, that we may not forget our mutual engagements." So here he refers to them as mutual engagements, and the title of the slide, of course, is clauses, treaty clauses, or mutual engagements. Well, I served last year. I served as a witness in a court case, and the issue became whether or not this actually was a treaty, even though Sir William Johnson refers to it as a treaty. The government of Canada disputed that the Treaty of Niagara is a treaty. They said it isn't a treaty. But the Anishnaabe, the Western Confederacy, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy all say that it is a treaty. So there's a dispute as to what actually a treaty is. So this is the belt that was given. This is a replica. We based it on. We don't know where the original is, but thankfully in 1854, a fellow named Reverend Hallen had actually did a rubbing of this belt, and he took the time to actually count the number of beads in each row and column. So we know the exact number of beads that went in to make this, and the sketch, and so we've made a faithful replica of both of these belts. So with this one is Niagara, 17th July 1764, with the chiefs of the Odawa, Ojibwe of Toronto, of Lake Huron, Lake Superior, the Nipissings, Algonquins, Menominees, Odawa, and Six Nations and Indians of Canada. Sir William Johnson says, "Brethren, reduced all of Canada, and of consequence became possessed of all the outposts," meaning the forts like Fort Michilimackinac and Detroit and Fort Pitt, which the French governor granted us by the capitulation. "Although we were numerous and able, we did not attempt anything against you. They," meaning the French, "often sent armies against you, killed many of your people, and meditated a design of possessing themselves of your country. We never attempted the one, nor intended the other." So basically what he is saying, and he's assuring them in council, is that we agree with you, because the chiefs, remember Pontiac War, he's saying that, yes, you own the land. That's basically what he's saying here. All we gained when we fought the French is the right to occupy the outposts, meaning the forts in the country. So the main point there then is how the Anishnaabe talk about this later, is they said, "You promised us that our children would own this land at Niagara. That's what you had said." And then this course gets into even bigger issues when you bring up the Royal Proclamation, but we won't really go there. Anyway, this belt doesn't just represent equality. It actually represents Aboriginal title as well. And that's why I used this quote, and because it was the Treaty of Niagara, and this is what Sir William Johnson had said to us at that time.
Okay. Question from Christine. Yep. Is the top wampum the covenant chain treaty? Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's the Covenant Chain Treaty. The other thing to mention to alert you all to is that the Covenant Chain actually started with the Dutch and the Mohawk on the Hudson River, and then it extended and got more elaborate afterwards. And then once the British defeated the Dutch, they assumed the treaty relationship with the Dutch, I mean with the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee. And then afterwards, the British decided to extend that Covenant Chain Treaty relationship to the Western Confederacy. So when I mentioned that the Haudenosaunee, I mean the Anishnaabe principally fought with alongside the French during the 1760, the Haudenosaunee were principally allied, with exceptions, but principally allied with the British at that time. So this is the Covenant Chain, and you see that there are two men on there, and one is represents a native person, the other represents the British. And of course, the dates on there is 1764, and those are chain links on there, representing chain links on there. And what you'll notice as well is there's like a symbol of a cross between the two in the middle, holding hands, representing Providence. So then the belt below it is called the 24 Nations belt. And this belt is actually a pledge you see the ship at one end and the rock at Quebec, or some say it's the rock at Quebec, others say that it's all of North America. Anyway, there are the 24 nations of Anishinaabe or Native people, and then the ship there is the British promise that they would always deliver presents to us for living on our land. So they said that that boat would never be empty, and if anything were ever lacking, they said all we would have to do is to tug on the cord of friendship, and then they would know that something was lacking, and they would look for what was missing in the boat, and they would load it, and then all 24 would get together and pull that boat to shore, and then they would be able to get what they needed. So that was the British promise at that time. So here, this is just to emphasize the metaphors, and this is Sir William Johnson had told the Confederacy. He says, I do not want your whole mat, just a piece of it. So, in these diplomatic speeches, the way the Anishinaabe recorded the Treaty of Niagara, they said, you had promised us and you had told us that you would erect a tree. You would stand up a tree in the center of our island. And under that tree, you swept all around it and cleaned it up. And then after you had swept around that tree, you laid out a mat. And then after you laid out a mat, you ignited a fire. And this is the Treaty of Niagara that he's talking about. And you had told us that once you ignited that fire, that you left choice pieces of wood there so that this fire would never go out. And that you promised then that you would send warmth to our country. So again, when we are talking about treaties, these are actual metaphors that were used. And of course, a mat represents a bedroll, but also represents your territory. So that's why they would use this uh, about the mat. And they would actually also refer to wampum belts as mats. So there's kind of a lot going on when we look at metaphors and how they talk in the diplomatic discourse. So right now, like I know we're talking about pre-confederation treaties. When you actually look at the treaties and the legalese that's used, some people may not actually know uh, the difference between a deed and a conveyance and a treaty. But what I'm trying to show you here is that actually on the other side is the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee had a set of metaphors that deserves equal amount of attention than the English language does as well. So an Odawa chief said in 1785, with a pipe in hand, he asks you, my father, to smoke from it. We show you the alliances that we have had with our different fathers, Sir William Johnson. This is why we present you today the mat of peace. And he's referring to a wampum belt. But they always talked about the mat, and it was an allusion to their country and their territory as well. So this is a letter written in Ojibwe, written in 1862. And I'm able to read it and I understand what it says, but it's actually all the promises that the British had made in 1764 at the Treaty of Niagara. And this medal, you see the bottom, the date there says 1764, and it actually accompanies that wampum belt. Different chiefs were given that medal. And you see there the tree that I referred to on the medal, it says Happy While United. And you see that the clasp on top is actually a calumet and an eagle wing. And I wanted to reinforce that that pipe, that calumet pipe that I showed earlier, is represented on that medal. That medal is a symbol of alliance. And then you see the two, a British man and a native person, are sitting under the tree smoking a pipe. And under them, what they're sitting on would be a mat. And then looks like there's smoke in the background of that fire as well. So the medal serves as a mnemonic device, as does the wampum belt. And then the chief, whoever the keeper of the chief of the belt was, and his young men memorized that belt and talk on that belt. And in 1862, 98 years later, they wrote down their understanding of that in Anishnaabe and in Ojibwe. So that's how we know what our version of this Treaty of Niagara is that, and that is our version, written in our own language. Oh, I should mention that here that the refrain, how this is a speech, but it's written in Ojibwe, and it's this misage ejenagwa denik katabanoji mo bemadzuan. That actually is kind of like a refrain in that speech. This is the image of the life of your children. That's what that means in Ojibwe. And he says each at different points, he says the sun will be shining brightly, and he says that's what you said to us, that this is the image of the life of your children. And they also said that wherever the sun touches on this earth, flowers will bloom. That is the image of the life of your children if you enter into alliance with us and accept this wampum belt. So that was what the refrain was, that everything was going to be good, sunny prospects, and prosperity for all. This is a painting, Manitoulin Island at Manitwaning. From 1836 to 1854 was this annual delivery of presents. You can't really tell, but at where the building is there, you see blue, black, light blue, and white. Those are actually cloth. The Anishinaabe were given cloth at that time, as well as blankets and other items. And these are all the different Anishinaabe you'd get. Sometimes you get 2,500 Anishinaabe there, and other times you get up to 5,000 Anishinaabe there to receive their annual presents and to renew or polish the chain, the covenant chain, wampum belt. And that one of the fellas there is Jean-Baptiste Siganok, and he's the keeper of that belt. Here's a list of items in 1822 that of all the items that were given, and that's on the left-hand side. But you see the cutbacks in 1854, how few presents were given in 1854. But in times of war, there would be even more presents that were given. So you see they were given molten, it's a type of cloth, strouds, caddies, ratteen, Irish linen, calico, striped cotton, to make shirts, leggings, and skirts. And then they were given blankets. 1 point is for a child. 3 point is a heavier blanket that was given to a chief. Silk handkerchiefs, hats, thread, and butcher knives, hunter pipes, tobacco, ball, gunpowder, guns. So the important thing as well that I want to emphasize is that the British gave us guns, ammunition, net thread, fish hooks, and as well as canvas for our sails. So they were actually outfitting us for our Aboriginal right to hunt and fish. That's what this belt also means. That's what I want people to understand. So here's the extra items. They gave us kettles, rifles, common guns, fishing hooks, cod lines, net thread, ribbon, Russia Scotch sheeting. That's that canvas I was talking about. So this is just so that's the thing I wanted to mention, is that the Aboriginal right to hunt and fish was recognized by the Treaty of Niagara. And in our understanding, whenever the British delivered those, they were acknowledging that. that we had primacy to go all over our land and continue to live as we did. So this is Chief Shinghua Kons, and in 1829 he was in council at St. Joseph's Island, and that's where the British council fire was at that time. Holding a few strings of wampum in his hand, it said, "Father, the great master of life, gave us pipes and wampum for the purposes of conveying our ideas from man to man." And then in 1852, when they heard the presents were going to be discontinued, meaning that the covenant chain was going to be broken, he says, "Father, we salute you. We beg of you to believe what we say, for though we cannot put down our thoughts on paper as you, our wampums and the records of our old men are as undying as your writings, and they do not deceive." Those are just two of my favorite quotes about wampum and pipe. So here's a series of wampum belts that were given by the British to the Western Confederacy. And they're all basically the covenant chain. Whenever you see two hands going together, or two men holding hands, that's a reference to the covenant chain and alliance. And the bottom one there, Ken Merica was told by an elder to put the two ends of that 1764 wampum belt together, and then you get the old symbol for two nations. And if you remember, I had said earlier that a nation on a wampum belt was represented by a diamond. So you see on the other side, if I were able to flip that wampum belt, if you look at the 1764 wampum belt covenant chain on top, you see a man, Anishnaabe, and a British holding hands. But then when we fold it and wrap it in a circle, then you see those two diamonds. So basically, the belt itself is, I think, is a near perfect melding of two traditions. Because prior to this, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee only used geometric images on wampum belts. The British introduced numbers, letters, and anthropomorphic figures. So basically, this covenant chain represents independence or sovereignty and being allies and friendship. It also represents land ownership or Aboriginal title, but it also represents protection. I didn't get to talk about the protection part, but if you just trust me, there is a part. And now we call that in modern day legalese or parlance fiduciary responsibility. And then the support or warmth, that's actually the clothing that was given, and the ammunition and the means to continue to procure our livelihood, and in payment for past services as well when we fought alongside them against the Americans during the American Revolution and during the War of 1812. And then it also represents our hunting, fishing, and timber. That's what this belt represents all together, and the medal. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Alan, thank you so much. I was completely, I'm just completely with you the entire time because, first of all, I mean, I've heard you speak before, but I feel like every time there's so much texture and detail to what you're saying. And I know that first of all, we have quite a dedicated audience today. We've had people stay with us the entire time. I haven't seen many leaving at all, which is usually what happens after the hour. So I just want to thank you for keeping us so enraptured. And I want to say too that from my knowledge, and it's a limited knowledge, there's not many resources out there right now for teachers which are giving this type of depth of knowledge and from this particular perspective. So I want to thank you for all your work and for sharing this today. There's no questions that are coming up right now, but I'm just going to cover a few things. And Alan, is it okay if you just stay with us for maybe 5 more minutes just in case anything comes up? Wow. Okay. So, folks, I hope that you've enjoyed hearing from Alan today. I know that I'm personally going to go back and watch this video that we've got now for over and over because I feel like I have so much more to learn. But I want to share with you as well some resources that can be available to you. I didn't see that we had many primary teachers with us today, but just in case there are leveled readers from Nelson, a publisher called Under One Sun, which start at the kindergarten level and begin to introduce young children to concepts behind treaties. like personal responsibility, Mother Earth, agreements, what's a promise, that kind of thing. Here's one example. I Can See Mother Earth is one of their kindergarten readers. There's also, I went to goodminds.com to see what they had available. And on their site, I found books like Dakota Talks About Treaties by Kelly Crawford, and also by Kelly Crawford, Alex shares his wampum belts, which are good for around grade 1 to 4. Also, there's a high school and up resource written by Marie Switzer called Nation to Nation, a resource on treaties in Ontario, which you may find useful. And finally, and this was John Paul's suggestion, you know, we're always thinking, go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which, if you've ever seen it, it's from the early to mid 90s. I forget the exact date. But it was those big, like, telephone book size resources, and it's dense. It's not just about treaties, but there's a lot of good information there that especially our high school and post-secondary students can go to as a reference. Yeah. So, Alan, is there anything to add or that you want to just quickly say about any of those things at all?
Actually, if you go onto YouTube, if you want to hear more of it, there's a lot. There's about 3 different videos of me online there on YouTube. So if you just Google me or whatever, search on YouTube, then there's a different. I talk about different belts, and in one of them I actually recite the whole belt. Yeah.
Okay.
So
well, you know what, Alan? What I'm going to do is we send out an email at the end of this to everybody once we get the video going. So I'm going to look at those up and I'm going to include them because I'm sure people want to learn more from you. So thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that those existed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've already done questions. So just in terms of our end notes, just to let you know that there are upcoming webinars. So if you want to keep in touch and you aren't already, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Listen and Learn, which is at angelanardozi.com/listen and learn. And ooh, there's so many things coming up in the chat right now. Most of them are thanking you, Alan. People are just, wow, people are just very thankful to you. And I missed a few. Let me just see if I can scroll. I apologize to my friends here. This is great. People are really enjoying the learning that you brought today, Alan. Yes, and some people are appreciating the resources as well. And so many thank yous. That's just what's all coming up. And so, Alan, I want to extend my thanks as well. A huge thank you, Chimigwich, to you. And also, I want to congratulate you because as we were talking, one of our admins went and did a little Google and found that you are, in the last year, have been the recipient of the Governor General's Award of Canada's Meritorious Service Medal. So I want to congratulate you on that. That's really cool.
Yeah, that was last
really
year.
Exciting.
Neil Demoski and I received that. Yeah.
Is it for your work on? Was it for your work on treaties or some other work that you've been engaged in?
Language work
Amazing.
as well. Ojibwe language work and the.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congratulations again on that, and thank you so much for the time that you spent preparing and for being with us this evening. Okay. All right, everybody. I want to wish you all safe travels if you're traveling somewhere before you reach your final destination tonight. And a good night, and a good night to you, Alan. It was wonderful working with you.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.